Welcome to The Creative Shift. My name is Dan Blank, author of the book Be the Gateway and founder of WeGrowMedia.com. Okay, so today I'm really excited to welcome back onto the podcast author Miranda Beverly-Whittemore. She and I met many years ago, and we had worked together on the launch of her book, Bittersweet, which became a best-selling novel. In that time since, she published another book, and then most recently this summer, came out with her new novel titled Fierce Little Thing. In this conversation, we cover a lot of ground. We talk about her career overall, specific decisions that she's made in terms of thinking about how she makes book deals, the team that she works with, and navigating changes in publishers, changes in editors. She talks about the writing of this book, including the very, very specific ways she did that amidst everything that has gone on for the last year and a half. And she, of course, talks about this book launch. When we spoke for this interview, it was early in the summer, still weeks before the book was to be released. And I think that that's always a special time to talk with a creator. In that moment when you don't know how it will be received in the marketplace, and you are making plans and you're excited and there might be even a little bit of good buzz, but you don't know. And I find that to be a really amazing time. It's like the idea of talking to someone right before they go on stage, where they're full of hope and full of maybe fear, and they're looking at what's right ahead of them, but also thinking about where they're going after. And Miranda really spoke in a wonderful way about the other projects she's working on, how she views her career overall, and just this process of creating and what it means to her. As always, it's so inspiring to talk to her and really see how she navigates this entire process. She is just incredibly honest and authentic with it. And before we get started, you can find Miranda at mirandabw.com or over on Twitter or Instagram. Just search on her name. You can find me on social media at Dan Blank. I always share these interviews and everything else I write in my weekly newsletter, which I've sent out every week for 15 years. If you want to sign up for that, it is wegrowmedia.com/newsletter. And of course, if you enjoy any aspect of this podcast, please consider leaving a rating or review over on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. All right, here is my conversation with Miranda Beverly-Whittemore. Hey everyone, this is Dan Blank. I'm really excited to be chatting again with Miranda Beverly-Whittemore. Welcome.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. It's so good to see your face.
Thank you. Same here. So when last we met on the podcast, so obviously we had shared a lot years ago around the launch of Bittersweet and the before, the during, and the after of that. And I'm actually not even fully sure what I've shared in the podcast and the blog since then. And I think it's kind of neat to maybe track from that time through where you are now. You have a new book coming out.
This little thing right here. So pretty.
Oh my gosh, it's so great. So, I mean, the big highlight of, when we were, really writing all those years ago on the blog with Bittersweet was the journey to it, of your whole, even catching people up. You had published a few books ahead of that, and forgive me if I'm misremembering, they did okay, but you were like, they weren't the expectations you had. Bittersweet, you put this massive effort into, and it worked out. It was not only obviously a phenomenal book, but it hit the New York Times bestseller list. All this sort of great things happened from that. Coming off that, how did you approach the next book in terms of what you wanted to write about, or the career, or even expectations? Because I find that's the problem with success, is that it doesn't usually alleviate fear. It kind of creates new, more complicated fears.
I mean, it's similar to raising children, in that when you have an infant, you think it's the hardest thing in the world. And someone's like, just wait till you have a teenager. And you think like, that's not true. And that's mean. But I have a 12-year-old now, and I realize it's a lot harder than it was having a newborn. Bigger kids, bigger problems. So yes, I think it is very easy to think that once you have had a New York Times bestseller, your career is made, everything's golden. I think, I am so lucky and I have had so much amazing support, but it is also really challenging to bring out any book, especially post-pandemic. But even pre-pandemic, are we post-pandemic, during pandemic, whatever we're in right now, it is challenging to just, and also book coverage has shrunk a lot, written book coverage. I think there's an amazing podcast world and online world in which people are actively sharing and talking about books, but there's a less formalized world, which kind of takes it out of the hands of the establishment, which I actually think is great. But as a result means that because the establishment is what decides, the establishment of, say, your publishing house is what decides how much money gets spent on your book or who your publicist is based on, how well they think your book's going to do or what the marketing dollars are. It can be tricky because they have a lot less power over kind of where they think you're going to get placement. So for me, that journey, I basically wrote Bittersweet. It did really well. That was really exciting. And then I had basically I think the day before Bittersweet came out, when we knew it was going to do well, because you kind of have all these indications, I actually sold them my next novel, June. I sold the same publisher my next novel, June. And at that time, I thought my editor, Christine Koprash, who I adore, who was at Crown, which is where Bittersweet came out, she acquired June. And I was so excited because I thought, we're going to finally get to write a whole book together, because she had acquired Bittersweet when it was already a full manuscript. So she helped me revise it, but we'd never worked together on a book from the beginning. And then she acquired June, and then not long thereafter, she left. She went to Flatiron Books, which was at that point a new imprint of Macmillan. And I was pretty heartbroken because I had already one time in my career where my book had been orphaned, and I felt like, oh, this is going to be a disaster. But Crown did a really great job with that book. I worked with Lindsay Stagnant, who was a great editor. And I think it was a little hard for them to know what to do with it because that book has a historical slant, and it's a little bit, June is about a small town in Ohio where there is a movie filmed in the late 50s. And it's about a girl from that town who's 18, who just turned 18, who falls in love secretly with the biggest movie star in the world. And he falls in love with her as well, but they keep it a secret. And it's about the repercussions of that love affair that particular summer to something that happened 60 years later, when that man, who has just died as a very, very old, famous man, leaves all his money to this young woman who lives in a small town, who has just lost her grandmother who raised her, and whose name is June. And that actor has a very, very famous daughter who's kind of imagine Jennifer Aniston, basically shows up on this young woman's doorstep, and it's like, who the hell are you? And why did my father leave all his money to you? And neither of them know the answer to that question. So it's about them kind of uncovering what happened 60 years ago. So that book had it had a murder in it. I think I'm kind of writing more towards the thriller end now. So I write literary fiction. It's the crossroads of literary and commercial, but I tend to now have more kind of dark elements in my books as I've gone on ever since Bittersweet. And so that book was less thrillery and more kind of it had elements of romance, it had elements of history, it had elements of old Hollywood. So it wasn't quite the same brand as Bittersweet. And I love that book. I'm thrilled about it, and I think it would make a great movie. But I definitely think that it kind of threw my publisher for a loop a little bit, because they were like, we love this book. And I think had Christine, who acquired it, stayed on, she would have had more of a vision for what that would mean for kind of the trajectory of my career. So after that book came out, Crown changed a lot. They really reworked a lot of kind kind of management within Crown. And it became pretty clear to me that there wasn't as much of a place for me in that publishing house. But at that point, I was 7.5 months pregnant when June came out, and I hustled really hard. And it was going on book tour that pregnant was really rough. So I was happy to kind of regroup. I took a little time off.
Wait, can we pause there? Because I have so many questions just about that phase. So one thing you mentioned, I remember this happening because I think we were maybe texting about it when it was happening or something, but you signing for the next book right on the cusp of Bittersweet coming out. And I just can you talk a bit about that strategy? Because I think that's something too that we talk to so many writers and they have their own version of that. And I can see it both ways, which is like, hey, there's all this buzz. You sign the deal when there's buzz, versus someone saying, no, wait, let's see what it does. And you'll have more clout next time. There'll be a bidding war, whatever. How did you parse through that strategy?
I think we knew, I've had the same agent. Her name's Anna Hawkins, since I was like 24, 25. And I really love Anne, and she never steers me wrong. She gives great guidance. And so she doesn't generally make flashy moves. She makes power moves, but she doesn't have any interest in showing off because she doesn't play that game, which is part of why I love her, because she's not deeply set into like the cool agent world, which like there are agents who many people I know and respect love working with, who kind of want to go to the right parties and are like, part of their thing is that they're cool. And my agent is cool inherently, but it's not part of her need to know about herself, if that makes sense. So she was like, when she decides to make a power move, I always know that it's actually a power move. It's not like a show off power move. Do you kind of know what I mean? Yeah. So she was like, I think this is a great strategy. You have outlined, you have, I think I had 100 pages at that point. You know what's going to happen. I think this is a great moment to take this on a partial, which is what that's called. It's like when you have like 100 pages in a synopsis, to take this on a partial to them, because your stock is really up right now. It's Bittersweet, right? And that means that they're gonna want to work with you. And for me and for her, actually, this is something we talk about a lot. And again, I think this makes her unconventional. I'm much less interested in a lot of money up front as a commitment on the part of the book community that's taking it on, the publisher, that they love the book. And because I think that less money up front often means that you defy expectations or you surprise people. And I will tell you that in my career, the times when I've happened to just defy expectations and surprise people are always better than when you disappoint, than when the expectation was up here and you were like, you came in about here. It's rough because the book world does not love that. And it's punishing and has the good news is they have a short memory, but your book sales remain in book scan forever. So
I think that is so counterintuitive to a lot of people. I love that. It's so wise. And I think I can so easily see a writer saying, I'm going to get as much money as I can because now is my time to get paid. Writers and artists never get paid, and I'm going to grab that and I'm going to push for the biggest thing. And there's all these great examples of that. And yet your advice is so great because the second you sign that, it's like, oh my gosh, I can't control how well this does. And then the downside of that, and
that's what happened with my first two books. I sold my books in a $400,000 2-book deal when I was in my mid-20s. And I have to say, I feel so lucky that happened. Like financially for me, that was amazing. In terms of my career and my emotional and mental well-being, it was not fantastic, right? Because of the amount of pressure on my shoulders to deliver in a specific way. And so I think I think writers should be paid a living wage. And I actually think that $400,000 for 2 books is just barely a living wage because it takes so long to write books and you have to pay so many taxes on them and you have to pay your agent, right? Like when you break it down hour by hour, I don't even know that that is like an hourly wage for writing 2 books. But that's in terms of book world, that's a massive amount of money. And it was a huge amount of pressure on me. So I would never want that again, honestly. I would much rather have a respectable amount of money paid for a book and then really have it take off and earn a lot of money on the back end. Like that's really exciting. Getting a royalty check, this happened with Bittersweet. I started getting, my first royalty check was crazy. This is why the New York Times bestseller list is so amazing, because you don't expect that money is going to come and it just shows up on your doorstep and you go like, what? This is shocking. So for me, and I will say that is very unusual in my life. Like I now get royalties for Bittersweet and they're like $800, right? Which again, that's a great amount of money. But I think the amount of money that comes in is really, I would always want to have it be on the back end instead of on the front end.
It speaks to how complicated and how different an artistic career is as well, because it's like, on the one hand, we want stability. Like if you or I were to take a traditional job in an office working in human resources, you'd have a set expectation of what to do and what you're getting paid and benefits. And it might be a job that you or I don't want to work and don't really love, right. But it's that versus this. And it's the choice is so interesting about that idea of money. And because there's a lot of memes out there, which are good, artists should get paid. And you're like, dude, I'm going to like that. I'm going to click like on that in a heartbeat. But then it's this complicated thing about expectations, the oddity of how publishing works or galleries work or music industry works. Like they don't operate like a normal industry would operate.
Well, and I also say that, like, again, I want to point out my luck and my privilege. I'm married to someone who is a freelancer. So like there are aspects to our jobs that are really crazy. And I will tell you all about what the pandemic was like for us, which will highlight that. But he does 2 jobs, one of which is on hold right now. But he's a massage therapist. And so that is like an hourly wage, basically. And then he's also a freelance history book editor. So that you get paid in these smaller chunks. So we've been able to carve out a life together in which I can earn unexpected large sums of money. And he basically earns these incremental, really consistent chunks of money. And so together, we're able to kind of find a balance, and we can bridge for each other those moments when one of us is suddenly unexpectedly earning less. And that's why marriage is a social contract and a financial contract in a lot of ways, because were I to be single, I would probably have to have a job that paid me in a more consistent way, right? So I recognize that privilege. It's an amazing amount of privilege. And yet, there's still this pressure. I say I would always want to have money on the back end, but I also want to get paid for my book. So once June came out, and then I stopped, I took a little pause to have a baby and kind of readjust to having a second kid in our life. I started working on my new book, which has become Fierce Little Thing, which is out from Flatiron in this coming July. And one of the things that I desperately wanted was to work with Christine again, who had edited Bittersweet. And Fierce Little Thing, I knew from the moment I started working on it, shared a lot of the same DNA with Bittersweet. It's about a group of teenagers who are raised in a commune on a lake in Maine, and in the 90s. And at first that commune is like, they're all from very different homes, many of which are kind of fractured in some way. And some of them are there with their parents and some of them aren't. But they become like family to each other. And that commune becomes more and more extreme and becomes more and more like a cult as the years go on, and has a charismatic leader named Abraham who really focuses a lot of attention on them, especially on our narrator, Saskia, and kind of putting all of this, like, you're so special, you're a special girl kind of energy on her. And they end up doing something really terrible to try to save the cult. He kind of convinces them that they're going to lose the land unless they do this specific thing. And they do this, and of course it doesn't work. So 25 years later, they're scattered to the wind, and they're our age, and they live all over the country, and they start getting blackmailed to go back to that land, to basically someone who says, I know what you did. So they all have to get back together, and they go back to this land in Maine. So it has, you'll recognize many of the same elements of Bittersweet. It's about legacy and secrets, and it's set on a beautiful lake. In this case, in an abandoned summer camp. It's really about friendship and the ways in which our lifelong friends know each other better than anyone. But when I started to work on this, I went to Anne and I was talking to her about it, and she was like, what do you want this book to do? And I was like, I'd love to work with Christine. So we actually sold it to her on a partial because I had that pre-existing relationship with her. And we sold it to her in December of 2019. And thank goodness. And because when March came around and we were living in Brooklyn, in our apartment of 20 years, which was basically rent controlled, and we, in a neighborhood that we had been way priced out of many years before, but where we had our kids' schools and dance studio and, all our friends and our life. And my husband had a thriving massage therapy practice in Manhattan. And, as soon as COVID hit, we were just like, you can't massage, right? Like, we just decided. We had a very conservative response to COVID. I think more conservative than many people, partly because—
Before we get into COVID, I have some questions, because that's a whole other story we're getting into of that time. So your relationship with Anne and with Christine, so you going to her, was that the type of thing where, because what I want to ask about is like finding those collaborators that you believe in. And it feels like such a rare thing in life. And I kind of love too, even how you say, I found Christine, and we're working on this book, and then she had to leave to go somewhere else. And that feels like it's also often a theme when you find these collaborators, that the world doesn't always give you the perfect scenario for it. In choosing to go with her and with Flatiron, was that was the only way, or were you giving up? Did you and Anne maybe feel there was other possibilities if you put it out to other people?
There were other possibilities, and we kind of decided. I said, I think maybe it was partly that I had a small child, and my bandwidth was pretty low in terms of like playing the book market. I was just kind of like, I want to work with someone who I know we will have an amazing connection. I really feel with Christine, she feels like my work wife. Like, our brains really click together in this fabulous way, and we can kind of speak in shorthand. We're really good friends too. Honestly, her older child is the same age as my younger child. So we also went through, that journey together in terms of having babies. And we're also we are very well matched. We have a very similar take on things. So I knew that there was likely to be other fantastic editors out there I could work with. But I also knew I had this dream ever since, she bought Bittersweet, but also ever since she acquired June, that we would be able to build the book together from the ground up. And I had this concept that would be this wonderful thing we could do. And she was really eager to do that too. So we took a gamble. I think we could have probably played a bigger game, but I would have had to write a whole book before we did that.
Mm.
And with Christine, we knew I would be able to sell it to her, likely on a partial, likely she'd be able to acquire it on a partial, and was probably the only editor I had a relationship with who would be able to do that. Um, so that was, so then when she did, that was great. I
That's awesome.
was willing to take it.
I love that.
Um, yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to ask about was sort of, I don't know the right phrase, but that brand, you saying, well, yeah, these are the kinds of books I write. And also having that become something known in the marketplace, where they pick up a book by Miranda and they expect something. Correct my memory here if it's off, but I remember you saying something about that when you were writing Bittersweet, you approached it really differently than your previous work. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's always stuck with me.
I mean, I think I was in a really desperate career place where I kind of had to decide, do I want this to be my career or not? Because I couldn't sell another book after my second novel came out. And so I felt a sense of like, okay, this is it. And I had lunch with the editor who had acquired my first book, who had left during that first book's coming out, but who had basically kind of like discovered me, if that's the word you want to use. And his advice was, oh, you just have to write a bestseller. That's all you have to do, right? So the bar was high, but I kind of took that as a really good challenge, because I was in a place where I was so desperate that I felt like, well, okay, so what could I do? So I actually did a lot of thinking about the kinds of books I love to read when I'm on vacation. And I thought about a reader like me, someone who is really curious, who loves great language, who is interested in a really twisty storyline with a lot of, jump scares and surprises, and doesn't mind a little good sex thrown in, and has really interested in female-driven content, like in the idea of a woman's journey, and wants to take that on vacation because they want to just disappear into a world that will be propulsive, that they can't put down. And once I had figured out kind of like what I like to read, I thought, well, the best chance I'm going to have to write anything that sells well is going to be to write that kind of book, right? Like write a book for someone like me, because I can't write a book for somebody else who has a different set of, ideas of what they like to read on vacation, because who cares, right? Like who cares what my take is on that, right? All I could do is think, well, like, I think there are enough people out there like me that hopefully they'll like this book. And I think what's interesting about Bittersweet, and I hope this is the case with Fierce Little Thing, is that it really does resonate with a wide population of readers. Like I will meet someone at a very high literary event and they will have read it and they will say, oh my gosh, I love that book. And then I'll meet someone in a hot tub in Santa Barbara, which happens too, and who was just like kind of like a regular California mom. And she was like, oh my God, I can't believe you wrote that book. I love that book, right? And she was not someone who I necessarily would have immediately thought would be drawn to a strong literary novel, right? So my goal, and this I think puts me always in a little bit of a disadvantage, because I do straddle genres, right? Like I'm not writing a strictly commercial book. I'm not writing a strictly literary book. I'm not writing a strict novel that's just a straight up literary novel. I'm not exactly writing a thriller, but I'm writing something that has those elements all mixed together.
So when you approached Fierce Little Thing, did you kind of go back to that was it a more conscious thing to say, hey, what are the elements that have worked and what do I enjoy? And let me kind of play in that universe in the same way the lab authors, like, what to expect? Or was it just coincidence, or was it something totally different?
I mean, it's hard to say, for me, like place is always such an important area where I start setting. And so Bittersweet was set in a fictionalized version of this place where my family has been vacationing for 60 years. My grandparents built a cabin there. It's very rustic compared to what the land is like in that book, but I could kind of use a lot of cues, and also the natural world, honestly, that I've grown up knowing really well, to tell that story and to kind of turn this place I love into like a grim fairy tale version of it. And so Fierce Little Thing is set up on land in Maine, where my husband has been going since he was a little boy, where his great aunt and uncle who lived abroad bought land in the United States, so they had a place to come back to in the summers. And it's a very lovely, small little lake in Maine where David's mom lives now. And so I've been going there for almost, for 25 years, I've been visiting that place. So I thought to myself, I kept thinking about that place. And of course, what's funny about it is that I think if you don't live in Maine or Vermont, you think those two places must be exactly the same. But in fact, they're very different in their landscape and what birds and animals are there and what the feeling of that forest is, and the feeling of the forest of Fierce Little Thing and of the commune, which is called Home with a capital H. I knew that I wanted Home to be on a much more kind of rustic, attractive land than Bittersweet, than Winlock, which is the place in Bittersweet. And I wanted it to be really punishing. And they're like the Back to the Land. They're Back to the Landers, but they're not great planners. So they decided to start the Back to the Land cult in Maine, which has terrible soil. So of course, like, it's a disaster in a lot of ways. And they're always struggling and they're always trying to make it work. And I thought that was probably more realistic than a really well organized commune that has a sense of how to do irrigation. It also gave me some chance to not know everything. Like because I'm not a Back to the Lander, so I don't know how to. I mean, I can read a lot of books, and I did, but I knew there was stuff I was going to get wrong, right? So I kind of wanted to think, like, what would it be like if you were actually growing up with these adults who had just decided to kind of leave their lives to try to do this thing that they thought they'd master, and then they don't. That seemed really resonant to me.
It's neat because it feels like there's these two things going on in the career, and like that I think is so fascinating, which is, on the one hand, you're being really aware of the marketplace and readers and what sells a book and themes and genre and all that. And that's that sort of that almost like a business mind. And then the other end, and I'm more familiar with your backstory too, is like, so yeah, you've for a very long time, you've had these two places that are on lakes in New England, that they go back 2 or 3 generations for each of your families. Your parents, what were your parents' career? Because they've got this fascinating backstory as well.
Right. My dad's an anthropology professor. My mom's a writer and ethnographer and midwife. And we lived in Senegal for a lot of my childhood. And my dad teaches now. So like I moved around a lot as he was teaching in different places.
So it feels like there's these themes that are inherently you,
right,
also in that. And I think that's such a neat mix. And I feel like everyone's got to find their way, but it's neat to kind of go back and forth, because as we talk about this, some feels like, well, it's you're the professional writer is calculating, but then it's like, it's totally who you are as well. And I think that mix is just so fascinating that you've got to find what that balance.
Yeah. And I think the thing that was interesting about writing Fierce Little Thing is that it's honestly, it's the hardest book I've ever had to write, for practical reasons, which we'll get into in a second, but also just even before that, it really stirred up a lot in me, because I think this book is more political than I knew when I was writing it, because it's really about how white men in power can manipulate people who are less powerful than them to get what they want. And that's like what was happening in the country as I was writing this book, and was such a source of so much anxiety and grief for so many people, and me included. And I was so angry, and I wanted to write about what it feels like to be a woman under the thumb of that, and to come out of it on the other side. And so for this main character, Saskia, she's doing the best she can. She's a girl who's been pretty abandoned in her life until that moment. And then she finally feels accepted in this place. And then that feeling of acceptance is used against her as like a weapon. And I thought like that resonated so much with my emotional core of being a woman in America in this era of writing this book. And I didn't expect that. It really shook me. So even before I sold the book, even as I was outlining it and writing it, I had a lot of anxiety and a lot of kind of like, is this the right thing? Is this good? I don't know. And a handful of people I really trust read it way back when it was just 100 pages, and everybody was like, I think this is the best thing you've ever written. And my experience of it was not that at all. I thought, like, I don't know what it is. It's like a horrible monster. I hate it, but I have to write it. It's compulsive. So when Christine bought it, when Flatiron acquired it, that felt like such an exciting next step, because I felt like, okay, it's worth it. And now all I have to do is write the book. What could go wrong, Dan? What could possibly go wrong? So we left the city. My husband had to close his practice when COVID hit. My older sister's a doctor, and she was in Seattle working. She basically treated the first COVID cases in this country. And so she called us in like early March and was like, it's airborne and no one's saying that it is. Wear a mask, get off the subway, take your kids out of school. It's not on surfaces. Or if it is, it's really airborne. So we knew pretty quickly that David couldn't massage. And we went through like a weird disjuncture of like 3 weeks where everybody thought we were crazy because we became like the people who were like on lockdown mode and everyone else was just living their lives normally. But he realized he couldn't massage. And I was so grateful to have sold my book, because I knew that I would be able to carry us a little while financially. And he quickly pivoted to his editing work, which is why it's nice to have a second stream of income, and was able to kind of like turn the volume up on that. And luckily, academia is still, desperate. People are even more desperate than ever to publish right now. So he was able to kind of turn that up. It's not his passion, but he's doing it, and that's great. And we were kind of itinerant for a while. We moved around and lived communally with a number of different people and tried to figure out what our next move was. And we ended up settling in Vermont, which is where Bittersweet is set. My sister and her family are living up in the cabin which inspired Bittersweet. And we're now living close by there. But that entire time, I had to write Fierce Little Thing because my book was due. I wanted it to come out this summer for financial reasons, but also because I needed it to be out of my brain space, because it felt very powerful and toxic. And I felt like I was working through the thought experiment, and I wanted it to not be hanging over me, if that makes sense. And so what that meant was fast tracking, really writing it with no childcare for my 2 children. And in fact, every person we've lived with communally has also had children. So that has been wonderful and kind of crazy. I can talk about the experience of writing about a commune and then basically living on communes for like 8 months. Just what I learned from that experience, and the brain trust of adults, and then of it's like the adults and then the kids, like the herd of children who we've tended to and taken care of through this time, which has been really powerful. But I didn't have a desk. I didn't have my desk. I didn't have any of the rituals surrounding writing a book. I didn't have any childcare except for what the adults in my life were willing to give to me. And I did it. It was like one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I had to write about 250 pages of a novel in about like 5 months, maybe less than that. Revise it all, hand it in the midst of like this crazy time. And as all of us know, like in those early months, we didn't know what was going to happen, right? So there was this overarching terror too, and also on top of that, my kids were displaced from everything they knew. So it was not an easy time. And
yeah, I got to watch a lot of this from afar through what you chose to share on social media. And I remember when it seemed like you'd left the home in Brooklyn, and where some decision at some point, I know you've lived different places, but you ended up, and I believe your sister moved with you, like you all sort of congregated up in Vermont. And that seemed really fascinating. as well to sort of have that, because you have a really tight family. From my
Yeah.
understanding, it's sort of neat too.
Well, she and I had a really powerful conversation. She was living in LA with her family. She has her older child is the same age as my younger child, within 4 months of each other, and then she has a baby. And she basically, we just kind of had this like come to Jesus conversation, maybe two of them, but in which we were basically like, she's like, this is going to last a long time. And I think, again, I want to say, like, I think we knew it was going to last a lot longer than a lot of people around us did, because of my older sister and because my parents lived in West Africa through a yellow fever epidemic, and also at the beginning of AIDS. And so I think my family, more than a lot of Western families, kind of understands how disease can really alter everything you know. And so there was this kind of just like implicit understanding that that this was really serious, and that it was probably going to last at least a year. And in fact, maybe 2 years. That's where we went into thinking about it. And I think a lot of people don't realize what a miracle a vaccine is, and like how unlikely it is that it happened the way it did. So we were not expecting this miracle. But so she called me, and we were basically like, she was in LA, I was here, and she was like, I cannot do this without other people. I cannot be on lockdown in my tiny bungalow. We need to be together. We need to like pool our resources. Our kids need each other, because that's the logical thing to do. And so she and her partner and their 2 kids, including their 5-month-old, rented an RV and drove across the country, and didn't stop, didn't leave their RV, brought all their own food, went to the bathroom on their RV. And they basically came to Vermont, and we came to Vermont, and we lived in this small cabin together for a couple months. And then we moved to the house that we're in now. But we still are each other's childcare. I mean, today is the day that she has our children. So we have one day a week where our children are not with us, and then one day a week when her children are not with her. And then the rest of the days we have this kind of like elaborate juggling act where we pass our kids off, or we put our kids in front of television, or they play independently, or, who knows. But that coming together was really central to our mental health. I mean, all of it became this, suddenly there were 4 adults and 3 kids, and my parents also were part of that. And of course, we were really concerned about exposing them to anything. So we didn't go into a store. We didn't, we were always masked outside. We basically took incredibly careful measures. And Vermont allowed us to do a lot of that, because we were able to really distance in a way that had we been in the city, we wouldn't have been able to.
And at what point in all of this, so you're clearly writing the book and collaborating, then publishing is shutting down and all that. At what point are you thinking of, this is the launch date for the book, or was that always unchanged? And what point are you moving into launch mode?
I think Christine and I had a conversation pretty early in March. I think I actually signed the contract on like March 30th or something, which was so bizarre. 2020, which was a real relief that they actually sent it to me. I got in touch with my agent. I said, I still haven't signed the contract, because it was clear to me that the world was about to really shut down. We were already on lockdown, but like that everything was about to shut down. And so I think my contract was probably one of the last contracts processed, and it was over DocuSign. And when I signed it and I pressed send, I was just so relieved. Yeah. And so then I think Christine and I had a conversation soon thereafter, and she was like, look, we get it. There's no pressure. This can come out a year from now, but actually, or a year from when we thought it was going to come out. So not this summer, but next summer. But there's so much in the book that is about this moment, which is also really fascinating to me. I mean, on a very funny level, there's a character in the book, which is the sourdough starter, because the main character in the past and in the present makes sourdough constantly, and learns how to make sourdough from one of the women on the commune. So it's hilarious to watch sourdough become this like huge trend in early pandemic mode, because I have been making sourdough now for a number of years, because it's a sourdough starter handed down to me from my older sister's family friend, and it started in Laramie, Wyoming in the 1840s. So it's like powerful. We call her the mother. So the sourdough character in this book is called the mother. And so that was really funny, but also just seeing like my own life, seeing how communally living, how living in a pod, right? I think a lot of Americans had their first experience with pods and the idea of like expanding your social circle to a group of people who you can trust, which is like an interesting value that Americans kind of don't know how to do, because we have this idea of the nuclear family being it. And yet, I think almost every nuclear family I know who either decided not to pod up with someone or did decide to pod up recognize why you might. Because it's really hard to parent children by yourself. It's really hard to take care of children constantly alone. And so I think a lot of people realize, oh, I need to do that. So that was really interesting to kind of read about, see about, think about, live this central concept to this book, which is like, you need other people to stay sane and alive. And then also in the book, there's this kind of fear of impending apocalypse, which in the book comes through in fear about the Ruby Ridge siege and then the Waco siege, and kind of that community's focus on the fact that they then believe that they're going to be besieged as well. And so that kind of like feeling of the outside world being terrifying and unknown and full of bad stuff that I think all of us also went through that experience of like, what's out there? I don't even know. I don't want to go outside. It's too scary out there. So I was really shocked as I wrote the book, because I really started to think there's so many things about this book that feel as though I knew what was coming, but of course I didn't. But I think that's just maybe America right now. And so it became this way to both escape what was happening all around us, and also to kind of channel a lot of that fear and anxiety and questions into this fictional world that I was building. And then I had this wonderful brain trust of fellow writers who were all trying to finish their own books, who helped me who read it and helped me revise it, helped me think about ways. I think one of the things that was tricky about this time was just like, there was no room for error, just in terms of time management. Like I sat down and I made my schedule of what I had to do, and I couldn't screw it up. Like I couldn't deviate from it, because you can only work. I only had so many hours a day to work, and I couldn't even work every day, Right. So
I can remember that from you, and I think it was before the pandemic and you would go to like a hotel or something, like I've got a writing day or writing weekend.
Right.
And I always think of that, which is like, like, it's amazing and awesome and incredible in one way. The other way too is like, when it's sort of like a musician with studio time, it's like, okay, someone's now paying hundreds of dollars an hour or thousands of dollars, whatever it is. So like, you're going to write a song right now.
Yeah.
And then if you doesn't come, then you have that guilt on top of the opportunity.
Yeah. And that's definitely what it felt like, because I also knew, anytime I was working meant that one of the other adults in my pod wasn't working, right? Or two of them. So that in some ways was even more direct than money. It was like, I'm doing work which means that David can't be working right now, or Kai, my sister, can't be working, or Rubidium, her husband, can't be working, or Molly, who is in our pod, can't be working. So that's like, in some ways that felt even more direct, because I had such honor for the work they needed to do, and such an understanding of how behind on work all of us were, that we had to it was this elaborate kind of passing of the work ball, whenever we could. And so, there was also this feeling of kind of ships passing in the night, of like passing the kids off, which, I'm sure you're familiar with. And also, like, I have to say, thank God for television, because we were not a big screen family before all this began. But oh boy, I really would not. I don't know what we would have done if we didn't have an hour or two of television starting at 4 o'clock every day, and feeling really like, wow, we made it to 4 was a big deal. And we didn't always make it to 4, you know? But yeah, I mean, just the logistics of working and feeding ourselves was so tricky. And I used to think it was so hard to like make dinner for everybody. And now, like last night, I made dinner for 9 people with no problem, because I mean, there's a lot in this book about feeding, just the logistics of feeding a group of people. And I've never thought more about that than I did in this past year, because I was constantly with a pod of people who were hungry at the end of every day. And so really trying to figure out how do we move food in and out of this kitchen was fascinating too.
So it's kind of neat too, as I mean, I think about this with a lot of creative people, is to come out of this, however everyone's doing it, and to have a positive creative focus. So I mean, to me, it's like awesome that this book is coming out now. I want to. Is that how you see it too? Which is now you're in it and you've got this great thing to focus on, and then even once that's done, then you get to move into a new phase.
Right. Yeah. Well, so there's also been this other work I'm doing, which I can't talk a ton about, but I'm developed. My sister and I and a third writer are developing Bittersweet to be viewed, right? So so that process has been also over the course of this year. It's like playing with that idea, working on it, developing it, thinking about it, and that has been this really fascinating generative kind of conversation, for lack of a better word, which is so different from writing a book by yourself. And that's been really fun to have other people to just kind of constantly be talking about it. One of the things that's been really amazing about living with my sister and being with my sister all the time is that we have all of these creative desires to work together, and have had for years, but have always had in recent years the excuse of like, we live so far from each other, and yet we've been together constantly this year. So we have really started to think about all of these projects we're working on together. She's a filmmaker and she's also a writer. And so we've started really developing not just existing IP that I have, but also a number of ideas that we've had together. And that's been really generative and exciting, and kind of feels almost like imaginative play, because we did play together for so many years as little kids. That there's this way in which you kind of talk through this world you've made up, which is exactly what our daughters do. I mean, our daughters are constantly in this mode of being like, and then you said this, and then one of them says it, and she says, and then I went up on the top of the mountain, and you said, I can't believe she could go on top of the mountain. And then the other one says, I can't believe she could go on top of the mountain. And then I said that, right? That is exactly what Kai and I are doing. And has that through line of having these kind of worlds that we both know that we can escape into has been immensely, I mean, it saved my mental health. I don't know what this says about my mental health, but having those wonderful places to escape into has been a miracle. And I've definitely learned a lot about, like I always knew I was really stubborn, but I felt that this book was Fierce Little Thing. There were any number of moments where it would have been absolutely acceptable to just stop and say, I can't do it. And I refused to do that. And I don't know that that's a good thing. I just know that it's what happened. And it was really interesting to know that about myself, to say like, okay, so this is a really one of the hardest periods of my life. And I hope it is the hardest period. But even in the midst of all this chaos and anger and misery and loneliness, I'm not going to stop. I'm keep going, which is, I didn't really know that was who I was.
I love that. So when we're talking, the book is not out yet. It'll be out in a bunch of weeks. When this
Yeah.
is published, I think it'll be launch week. You're getting a lot of like really good chatter about this
Thank
book, which
you.
is
I hope
exciting.
so. Yes, I know it is really exciting, especially in this
Um,
moment, because I feel like it's really a weird time to publish a book.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's hard to imagine a time in the last bunch of years where it's not that, but yeah, it's all like, yeah, it's uniquely weird right now, and it feels like every day everything is uniquely weirder than the day before. It's just different.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Everything's changing so
Yeah.
quickly, and it's a lot of positive change in many ways, but it's also like disorienting. Um,
Totally.
so how are you thinking of the launch in terms of what you're doing, whether it's in person or virtual or whatever, or the trajectory of the summer with you?
Well, so my publisher is not scheduling any in-person events. So I'm trying to see if I can get one off the ground here in Vermont, just because I think it would be fun to get all together. Um, I'll do at least 2 virtual events, I think maybe 3. And I'm trying to do a bunch of podcasts because I think that they're really fun and interesting and ways to kind of get into people's ears. And, I'm trying to just, I spread the word by sending ARCs to writers I really love and know and admire in the hopes that they would help me spread the word as well. And they've been doing a really great job of that, which has been really wonderful. And then it's a lot of just like crossing your fingers and hoping, I mean, I'm doing my best to kind of stay in the mix, but I'm still also in a mode in my life where I don't have any childcare and it's summertime. And so I'm also trying to, how should I say, to like mitigate. The thing about when you have a book coming out is you could just constantly be stressing about whether it's going to get the coverage it wants, and you want it to. And I think with a few exceptions, you'd always feel like it's not. So one of my desires to do in this period of time is to feel a sense of gratitude for everything that is happening and work towards not feeling panicked every minute, that it's not on every single best of summer list, you know? And one of the things that also is really awesome though about publishing your 5th book is by this point, I have an understanding that books have a life of their own, which is such a fabulous experience to actually live, which is that people read books on their own time and come to them in their own way. And so I can get emails from people who've just read my first novel, right? And say, I love this book. I never thought about these ideas before, right? And for me, that book came out, 16 years ago, right? But for that person, those ideas are fresh and new. So I think that's the other part of it that I've been really loving, is seeing people come to any of my books in their own time and having the sense of like meeting them in that place. And I also think the thing that's nice about a 5th book is that, I know this is what I do. It would be nice to have this pay my bills for the rest of my life. But I know that I'm going to write books. So I'm not artistically frustrated in that way. And I think especially after this past year, I know I'm definitely going to keep doing it. because if anything was going to stop me, it was going to be what this past year was like, and it didn't. Right.
Yeah.
So I'm going to keep going. And it's really fun to see people connecting with this book, because I think, because when you're writing, especially in such a weird time, I just kept thinking like, what is this? Will anybody is it even in English? Like that the isolation of that moment was so great that I was like, I'm just here in this room and I believe that people will care about this, but maybe they won't. But I care about it. And that's all that matters right now, is I've got to keep going. But what I've had a lot of people say about this book to me, especially women, is that the book gets at this idea of what it is that there's a very specific type of girlhood in this country that is celebrated, which is the idea of kind of like the special girl who's really smart and seen and curious and, you know, does well with the grown-up. And that's who Saskia is. But she's still a child. And that journey of her going from being very troubled by the ways in which she is made to kind of express her specialness, to her journey to being an adult and kind of reclaiming the ways in which she really is special. That journey is one that I'm really excited to have people read about. And also, you know, it's got a good murder in it.
We've covered a lot. Is there anything that I haven't asked about that you think we should talk about any of this or anything else either?
I don't think so. I can't think of anything right now. I think we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, I think so too. Oh, I'm so excited. Thank you for taking the time and catching us up on everything. I'm so
Dan,
excited.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You can find Miranda Beverly-Whittemore over at mirandabw.com, over on Twitter at mirandabw, or on Instagram, mirandabw1. Her new novel is called Fierce Little Thing, wherever books are sold. My name again is Dan Blank. You can find me at wegrowmedia.com or on social media at Dan Blank. Thank you so much for listening until the end.